Hello, very beautiful community. Mr. Putin just got challenged and confronted in public in a way that he usually doesn't experience. So we're going to analyze that and then get into a big takeaway for us in general, beyond Putin, beyond Russia, about the balance of democracy and authoritarianism in the 21st century. So, what actually happened? Well, there is a very strange body called the Presidential Council for Human Rights. And you might say, why on earth does a body like that exist inside the Putin regime? It must be some kind of a sick joke. And it is a sick joke up to a point, but there is a caveat. And the caveat is that up until the full-scale invasion of Ukraine, this Presidential Council for Human Rights had two functions. One was to legitimate Putin's power, but the other was to give some of the more liberal-minded members of the council an opportunity to rescue some individuals from the claws of the regime without in general challenging the regime's repressive apparatus. So what would that look like in practice? It'd be something like this. Mr. Putin, you have arrested these 7 people for political reasons, but they're sick and elderly and they're in jail. They're not going to last long there. Can you do something about this? At least put them under house arrest instead. Or, Mr. Putin, you've arrested these people for some political reason, but you've actually got the wrong ones. They're literally the wrong people. So if you want to do this political repression, at least catch the right people. Your courts were not able to recognize this. Here is the evidence. Or, Mr. Putin, this hospital that's a center for treating children with this particular terminal illness is not getting the funds it needs because some kind of bureaucratic disgrace is going on. Please take a look at it and fix it. And what Mr. Putin can say is, well, no, I don't share your criticism on this occasion. I'm afraid I won't do anything. Or, yes, okay, that sounds fair. If we've got the wrong people, we'll look into it. Or, oh, children, seriously sick children. Oh, yes, I'm going to come in and rescue them. So from Putin's point of view, this platform gives him a possibility for the theatrics of rescue. And for the liberal-minded folks, it gives a possibility for genuine rescue, however, of a pointillistic kind, rescue that doesn't actually require to push in general against the state's repressive machinery. So it's a kind of a weird dance of mutual advantage in which the regime reluctantly agrees to throw a few life rafts to people who have been thrown off the boat by its own repressive policies. Now, when the full-scale war began, this process changed because at that point, about a dozen members of the council took an anti-war stance publicly, and most of them were kicked off the council. But a few managed to hang on and ever more meekly continued to engage in this dance of mutual advantage with the regime, where they were rescuing some people and the regime in the shape of Putin himself was doing these performative dances of humane rescue. What Putin hasn't been hearing at that council is generalized critique of his politics. Putin has been hearing, can we rescue this person? Can we rescue that person? He hasn't been hearing, your politics is off. Now, of course, he can't hear a critique that says that he is illegitimate and his war is wrong, put boldly and directly, because if somebody said that, then they would, depending on who they are, probably have days to leave the country. But nevertheless, here, what we witnessed was quite a shockingly broad critique of Putin's politics presented to his face by the standards of the kind of fare you might expect to hear on that council. And so this was the film director Alexander Sakurov. You may have seen his film Russian Ark from about 20 years ago, criticizing Putin on several topics. One we're not going to watch. I'll briefly tell you about it now. And the two we're going to watch is going to be about state censorship and repression. And the second one is going to be about the Putin's foreign agents law. The bit we're not going to watch is about the fact that children of war vets, folks who signed contracts with Putin to go to the front, have been receiving positive discrimination in the higher education sphere. And so gifted Russian kids, Sakurov was arguing, are not getting state-sponsored university places because they're being taken up by the children of war vets. And Putin entirely rebuked that criticism from Sakurov because he said, I'm going to give it to the children of war vets. And his rationale here is really twofold. One is that he wants this freebie for folks to get motivated to sign contracts with him. And the second is that he is out to break this generational challenge he faces. And in a way, his full-scale invasion of Ukraine was partly about that too, about the fact that he had lost the youngest generation. His response to that was, well, I'll just suppress them and then cultivate a next younger generation that then supports me. And, you know, inserting the children of war vets into the higher education system is one way of doing that. In practice, over the next decade, this will backfire on Putin because the vets and those who survive and their families are going to be a destabilizing factor for the Putin regime, in my assessment. Now, the reason this looked bad for Putin is that most Russians don't think that war vets deserve these privileges because they don't see the people fighting for Russia in Ukraine as people who are actually fighting for Russia. About 80% of the Russian population, I would guess, don't see things that way because it's a hyper-neoliberal war. The way most Russians feel, and certainly the depoliticized blob feels that, so these are not anti-war people. These are people who are just radically depoliticized and outsource their politics to Putin. What they feel is that they live on a territory over which this political authority happens to have power, with which they don't necessarily identify, like you likely do identify with the governance of your country. And that authority sometimes strikes deals with people about going to the front. Well, it's a business deal between these two parties, the contract soldier and this authority that happens to rule this territory. What have I got to do with it? If the business deal works well for the contract soldier and they survive, fine for them, I guess. But if they don't survive, then tough luck. They made the business deal and it went wrong for them. But don't tell me they were fighting for my country. I don't recognize that thought. So the people who recognize that thought are really about 10 to 20% of the Russian population. It's a similar proportion to the proportion that is positively and substantively anti-war. Again, 10 to 20% of the population. So that already doesn't look good for Putin. Moreover, he can't really concede anything to Sakurov here, so he can't look like the rescuer-in-chief. So he hates that too. So it's not nice. And Sakurov was just warming up. He got even more critical, and we're going to watch this. So let me turn on record. So I'm going to make a right hash of this, but I'll just try to play Sakurov speaking and translate as we go. Let's see if we can manage it. Okay, go. We don't know how to deal with complex human beings. We can't and we never could. We can't and never could conduct political discussions with young people, with older school children, with university students. In this country, we are afraid of these discussions. In general, the absence of political discourse in our culture, the culture of open political discussion that's calm and non-hysterical, the absence of this, and the absence, in a certain sense, of a serious oppositional stance and discussion of a serious oppositional stance actually constitutes a very serious blow upon the fates of many, many people, talented people, gifted people. We see this in the world of cinematography, in the world of literature, in the way bookshops work. What happens is that the state takes issue with the activities of creative professionals. And in my view, this is a very big and serious problem because people are deprived of the possibility of realizing their creative projects and even the possibility to do their job. And these people aren't told why they're being treated in such a harsh and uncompromising way. I am being told, for instance, that when my films are banned, I should go and speak to the president. But what is the reason for forbidding my film? I don't get a reason given to me. When I was going through this within the Soviet formation, it was always explained to me why my film wouldn't be shown in the Soviet Union. The same was explained to Mr. Tarkovsky. It was explained to him why his film wouldn't be shown in the Soviet Union. It is critically essential that dialogue with the creative sphere went on calmly, ongoingly, and in a balanced manner. Not a single bit of censorship, whether of architecture or music or literature, not one has stood the test of time. All of these prohibitions lapsed because all prohibitions of work of art are doomed to fail from the beginning. Try to make a film today like The Ballad of a Soldier. This is a film from the late 50s that's not so much a propaganda film as a film about the tragedy of war. What would happen to a filmmaker who made that film today? Would they be able to work? We don't know. This is a very important situation. We must decisively change the tonality of the relations between the state and the creative sphere and young people. If we don't change this, don't change the way we work with young people, we won't get far. It'll be a total regress of the state system. So, very indirectly, very meekly, very courageously, also pathetically, because it's just disgusting to be on this council, Sakurov is saying to Putin, your system of censorship will collapse. But indirectly, that's just to say his regime will collapse because his system of censorship could only collapse when his regime collapses. Putin is not going to be too exercised about hearing this, but he's going to be a bit exercised about hearing this because it's a general criticism of what is happening within the country. So he can't immediately deflect by talking about the big war he's doing against NATO. And he doesn't like talking about domestic politics in a way that's, detethered from the special circumstances of the war, because he always uses the special circumstances of the war to make an excuse for what's happening inside Russia. So he wouldn't like it from that point of view. And he also wouldn't like it because he can't engage in theatrics here, because there's a general criticism. There is not an ask there. Moreover, there is not a personal ask. So Putin can't look like he is a kind of humanitarian rescuer, nor can he look like he is as kind of a loyal acquaintance and he's going to do something for somebody who's asking it. Let's see what he says. This question was always a difficult one. It's always been like this. You talked about a ballad of a soldier, but it wouldn't have been made today. Well, it's hard to agree with you. Ballad of a Soldier is a film about love for motherland and love for a mother. Of course, we would have made it today. We need these films today. No, that film would struggle today. Now, Sakurov isn't finished. He keeps on escalating. Now he's going to take on the foreign agents law. It's with trepidation that we observe every week people being designated foreign agents. This horrifying label. It is horrendous that my contemporaries are suddenly tagged as foreign agents. I appreciate that there is a political category of this kind. But what in fact happens is that an issue is taken with a particular person, this tag is attached, and it's not clear what they can do with it, how they can go on. It's an incorrect decision. It's a dehumanizing decision. It doesn't allow the individual to develop. It doesn't allow them to exist as a citizen. It's absolutely apparent to me. Putin answers, yes, I know your position about this. But we didn't invent it. This was invented by the United States in the 40s. I think in the 30s. The Foreign Agent Registration Act. In the States, you risk imprisonment if you don't comply with this law, but we don't have that. Yes, they do, up to 5 years, and Putin knows this because it's a law signed by Putin. The only thing that really matters for us is that we get to see the financial accounts of people who are funded from abroad. And so I don't think we should go crazy and get worried about this. But on the other hand, we also shouldn't wave about this legislation all over the place. We must be careful with it. All right. So I won't go on analyzing this in circles, but I want to give a big takeaway for us that's beyond Sakurov, beyond Putin, beyond this weird Human Rights Council that is now overwhelmingly full of pro-war, pro-Putin yuckies. What we take away from this is this. The line that Sakurov was pushing there was about justifying power as authority and not mere power. Notice how much he emphasized the individuality of people, the individuality of citizens. So it's a special feature of the modern world that all power has to justify itself to everybody who is its subject. Not just some of its subjects, but each subject. And we can't really get out of this conception in the modern world, because in the modern world, we think in the way we didn't 500 years ago, that each human being is of equal moral worth. We certainly don't practice that and never will. But even when we grossly violate that notion, we still try to publicly pay service to it. So it's a conception we're stuck with, that you have to justify your authority to each group that's your subject and to each individual that's your subject. And that creates not just a normative, but a practical challenge to tyrannical rule. It's a problem, not just some kind of ethical, but a practical problem for the Chinese regime, for the Russian regime, that such questions can be asked. And once asked, they generate answers that are unlovely for the regime and risk triggering social change. The regime must preempt the public asking of such questions. Right? So there's a structural instability inside authoritarian rule to do with the way the legitimation of power functions in the modern world. And that creates an optimistic story to parallel the pessimistic story of democratic decline that we're going through. And the democratic decline we're going through is partly an optimistic story too, because it's driven by social forces we mostly don't control, but partly can control. And if we do control them and then speak honestly about them, we can do a lot to keep people like Trump out of power. So we have a capacity to inflect this too. We can't entirely fix this problem, but we can do a lot to mitigate it. So it's not an entirely hopeless story, but it's a story where we don't have total control at the level of just solving the problem. Some problems in politics are insoluble. This is one of them. We can do something about it, but that's the limit of our power. So there's something to be pessimistic about there, because it means that our democracy is trending south. But the optimistic counterweight I'm putting on the table now is that in the 21st century, there are going to be 3 or 5 or 7 major rollbacks, major collapses of authoritarian power, because of the instability at the level of legitimation that is structured into authoritarian rule. Authoritarian rule has a practical problem of justifying itself to its subjects in the modern world. I mean, that is why Putin is so afraid of everything. That is why he needs to eliminate political opponents. That is why he needs to start wars to keep power. It's not because his authoritarian rule is so stable. And so, as well as recognizing the significance of the democratic decline trend, we also have to be honest, politically, psychologically, and historically honest about the structural instabilities of authoritarian power. Lots of love and talk soon.